Dr. Fox, it's an amazing privilege to have you here. You were the Defense Minister and you've been a long-standing Member of Parliament, and you were the first Member of Parliament to come out in favor of Brexit. So I want to talk to you a bit about your views on the risk that Britain does indeed choose to leave the European Union.
Well, the first thing to say about that is that the status quo is not on the ballot paper. If we vote to leave, it is one kind of risk that we take and one kind of change that we face. If we choose to remain, it's a different type of risk and a different type of future that we have. On balance, I choose to leave, and for really three reasons. First of all, I want to get control of our lawmaking, and increasingly we've had laws imposed upon us from the unelected European Court. And I find that profoundly unacceptable, because I've always believed as a democratic principle that those who live under the law should be able to throw out those who make the law if they don't like them. We can't do that in this circumstance. That for me is the number one reason that's unacceptable. Secondly, I want to get control of our borders. And at the moment, with the European principle of free movement of people, we've had about 1.2 million European Union citizens settle in the United Kingdom in the past decade. Now, we might want to do that anyway, but the point is it should be our choice. And the third reason is that we send about 10 billion net or thereabouts to the European Union each year. And I think a country that's running a deficit of 70 billion and still spending way beyond its means should not be sending that money away abroad. And even if we were able to control it, we might want different priorities, even if we chose to spend it rather than save it. So for a whole range of reasons that all revolve around sovereignty and control, I want us to take control and leave.
So I hear you on the sovereignty piece. What's really interesting now is the Prime Minister has thrown out onto the table this idea that if Britain leaves the EU, there's risk of European war. Now, as a former Defense Minister, what's your take on this?
Well, I think the hyperbole is getting out of hand. You know, we didn't quite get to the Black Death stalking London or the Brexit meteor hitting us if we had the audacity to leave. This is really getting out of control. We need to have a much more mature debate than that in this country. And we do need to understand that it's a balance of risks. And there's a temptation, especially I have to say on the Remain side, for saying if we leave the European Union, everything about our national life will fall apart. Our security, our protection from terrorism, our prosperity, our influence in the world, it's not credible. This is a country that even if we leave the European Union, we've still got a permanent seat in the Security Council. We're still in the G7, still in the G20, still at the heart of the Commonwealth, still at the heart of NATO with the world's fifth biggest defence budget, a seat on the IMF, a seat on the World Bank. I mean, it's hardly being consigned to outer darkness if we're not controlled by the Brussels bureaucracy. So we need to really get a grip on the reality of this. Yes, of course, if we're not in the European Union, you have to ask questions about how do we get the cooperation that we have at the moment on certain elements of information gathering. But why do we have these agreements in the first place? We have them because they're in our mutual interest to do so. And we in the United Kingdom have the biggest intelligence services in Europe. So are we really saying that the German government or the French government would not cooperate with us and put their own citizens at risk as a political punishment for Britain voting democratically to leave the European Union? I just find that too hard to believe in the real world.
I hear you. And another element of this is the whole conversation about how the city will suffer and financial services will no longer be headquartered in London, which I find really bizarre because by definition, financial services do best with the least amount of red tape, regulation, high tax. And Britain's already emerged as a very tax-friendly environment for investors. And my guess is that if there were Brexit, it would be a less red tape environment than the EU would propose to put forward. But I'd be interested in your thought about what happens to the city.
Well, we're being told by all the same people in the city that it will be a catastrophe, a calamity, an Armageddon if we leave the EU, as who told us we had to join the euro and had to join the ERM. They've been consistent, at least, in the fact that they're integrationists by stealth, if not explicitly. But why does money come to a city like London? Why does money go to New York and not to Frankfurt or Paris to the same degree? I think money will go to where money can be made and where money can be moved. And there are a number of reasons why money will come to London, not least our legal system and the fact that people know when they put money here, they can take that money out when they want. When you combine that with a highly skilled economy, with a low level of industrial unrest, when we've got the English language, some of the best universities, the right time zone, there are so many things contributing to why money comes here that I think it explains why it's untrue when the Governor of the Bank of England says that Britain gets the lion's share of inward investment. That's why we must stay in the EU. Because if that were true, and all these other things weren't there, we would get a proportionate share of inward investment in the European Union. If we're getting the lion's share, it's because there are other factors at work, and so you have to work out how much to factor into that, the European Union membership, against all those other factors, including our low tax and deregulatory environment, which has just been assessed as being, apart from the Netherlands, I think being the lowest regulatory environment on the European continent.
Which raises a question about what happens to sterling, which is of great interest to lots of the viewers of Real Vision. And my guess is sterling has already begun to devalue. It will devalue more going into this vote. If it's an actual exit, it will probably devalue more. But at some point, people will add up all the pieces of the puzzle and say, but actually, it has a competent economy that can stand very well. And it will begin to push sterling back up. I'd be just interested in your thought about what happens to the currency and confidence in it, especially because it's such a critical issue given the high level of debt here in the UK, but across the industrialized world, people really care about fiat currency at this moment in history.
First of all, I think it's a fool's game to predict currency levels because whenever the bank talks the currency up, it inevitably comes back down again. And we've seen already in the last few weeks a wipeout of the loss against the dollar over the past year. We were touching 147. We're down a little bit at the moment, but there's not been a great change. Today we had, or this week we had a set of balance of payments figures showing an increasing trade deficit, with people saying that the pound was too weak against the euro. And yet these are the same people who say you have to fear it becoming weaker if we have a Brexit. I mean, you cannot have it both ways. Currencies go up and down. The fluctuation of a currency is one of the ways in which your economy has a shock absorber. If you don't want to take that as unemployment, which is what you get in the Eurozone, where they don't have that ability to have that fluctuation in terms of national economies. So it will go up and it will go down. And, you know, it ties into this whole tariff debate, because if you're looking at WTO tariff levels and you're talking about 3.5% and sterling's fluctuating at 6% a year, it gives you an idea of the scales you're talking about. But I think this idea that British exit is a one-way bet either way, and you get people actually making the converse case, I think that, as I say, is a fool's game.
So that maybe lets us jump to President Obama's intervention in this question as a very interesting development, given that if roughly half of British trade now is with the European Union, which is a part of the world that's not growing, then maybe more of it ought to be with a part of the world that is growing, which is the United States. And yet the United States is saying, stay in.
Well, there are a whole range of nonsenses about the American position. First of all, let's take the fact that the United States would never allow a court in Toronto to overrule the Supreme Court in making law. And they would never allow anyone to tell Congress how it should spend its money, although a lot of Americans would quite like them to do that. And they would never be in a position where Mexico determined how porous the border was with the United States. So the United States government shouldn't be telling us in Britain to swallow things that they would never in a million years swallow for Americans. But let's leave that little part aside. The trade argument was an interesting one, because we've seen our trade with the European Union diminish from about 55% 10 years ago to about 42% at the moment. It is a shrinking part of the global economy. Who is Britain's biggest single trading partner? The United States. And we don't have a single bilateral trade deal with the United States. So when the president said we'd have to go to the back of the queue for trade deals, what he meant was we would have to wait to not have the trade agreement that we don't have today. It was a complete absurdity. But there was a much more serious point, I think, underlying all of that, and which has caused a lot of offence, and I have to say caused personal offence to me. And that was this idea of you are a great ally, but you'll have to go to the back of the queue if you do something we don't like. And I think the reason this has upset so many people in Britain is they will say, do you know what? Our armed forces weren't at the back of the queue in Afghanistan or Iraq when you wanted an ally to fight alongside you for a common enemy. So why should we take this treatment or this lecture from you on this particular issue relating to the EU? And I think that has caused offence, and I think a lot of people who might have admired President Obama have a very negative view of him as a consequence.
There's also the issue of the sentiment on the continent, and countries like the Netherlands recently expressing a 2/3 vote against the arrangement for bringing Ukraine into the European Union, which was already approved, signed off by the Prime Minister. And suddenly we see this anti-EU sentiment in a country that's at the heart of the European Union. Same thing in Denmark, some rumblings, people referring now to Dexit, which is the risk of a Danish exit. So maybe can you talk a little bit about, if Britain does go down this road, and it's not very far away, what do you anticipate will happen in terms of the anti-EU sentiment within continental Europe?
Well, I think you need to stand back and look at that wider picture. I had a conversation with one of the senior commissioners just before the last European parliamentary elections. And I said, in this election cycle, it's likely that about 1/3 of the voters will either vote for parties that want to leave the European Union or want to end and destroy the European Union. I said, and if that gets up to 1/3 of the voters, will you change course as a consequence? And the answer was very instructive and very typical, I have to say, of the European bureaucracy mind, which said, no, if 1/3 want to leave or destroy it, that means that 2/3 don't, and we'll continue in the same direction. And that struck me as being incredibly complacent. And I think it's typical of the old men of Brussels who have set themselves on a trajectory in the 1950s and are unwilling to change it now. And you've seen a whole generation of young Europeans sacrificed on the altar of the single currency, and it seems that those who are in the driving seat don't care about their plight. That, I think, is a rather long answer to your question, but I think is behind this rise of anti-EU sentiment. And you see it right across the continent. You see it in the Front National in France. You've seen it what's happening in Germany at the present time. This is dangerous if unchecked. My father voted to join the common market way back in 1973. And one of the reasons he gave was, I think we should diminish the nationalist sentiments and the tensions that led to 2 world wars emanating from the European continent. And yet I think now, by being unwilling to bend, those who are running the European Union risk it breaking. And I think when I see barbed wire going up across the continent, fences being built, I think we're seeing the rekindling of some of those nationalist tendencies which were meant to be eliminated by the project itself. And they do fundamentally need to change. And if Britain leaves the European Union because we don't believe that its structure is suitable for our future, then it's up to the EU to change course if it doesn't want other countries to follow us. And this idea that we have a duty to remain in an organization which we feel is heading in profoundly the wrong direction, which is intent on ever closer union in a world that is becoming more open and more outward looking, then I think that people just do not understand what the British people are actually trying to contemplate for their own future. We've always been an outward-looking nation. We've always believed in free trade. We've always been out there putting forward our views on freedom and democracy and rule of law. And we feel we're being tied into a straitjacket of a European Union. Other countries, I'm sure, would love to get the opportunity to have the say that we're going to have in June. And I think the more that sentiment is repressed and the more that it goes towards an inward-looking, navel-gazing structure, the more it's likely to cause a backlash against it. And that has its own dangers in terms of the security and stability of the continent.
And could it be argued, I've been arguing that this is even bigger than that. It's just part of an anti-establishment sentiment that is percolating up globally. When you describe, kind of the old men of Brussels and their fixed ideas about how things should be done and what's in your best interest, to my ear, that sounds like the senior management of the Republican Party, right? Who are like, we will decide who will be in charge, who will be the nominee, and what that person's policies will be. They're almost so disconnected from reality and the way in which technology has empowered people with transparency and knowledge so they can see the facts without having to be told what's in their best interest. Do you also see it as more of a global phenomenon of an anti-establishment movement?
Yes. I'm not one of those who say that everything in the European Union has always been wrong, but I don't think that they ever understood the significance of the fall of the Berlin Wall or the world that was developing on the other side once the bipolarity of the Cold War disappeared. And a lot of people don't like the phrase, but you want to call it the multipolar world, emerging markets, different power structures in the world. We've all, in that period, in terms of geopolitics, also experienced an information revolution. And we live much more bespoke lives than ever before. So people will only watch the type of news that they want to watch, not that which is decided for them. Some people don't watch any current affairs at all, which has an impact, I think, on that very same phenomenon. And I think that there is a much wider anti-establishment feeling. I think you've seen it in the Trump phenomenon in America. And in the British referendum, I think you see it manifested in this way, in that you've got the big banks, Goldman Sachs funding the Remain campaign. You've got the big oil companies, the biggest corporates, the government, the European Commission, all saying, you ought to stay. And there's a feeling that, well, do you know what? You're not actually affected by the immigration pressures. It doesn't matter to you if I can't get a house, or I can't get a place to see a doctor, or I can't get my kid into a local school, because you don't use any of them. And I think that we're seeing in the referendum an exacerbation of the very tendency that you describe. It is manifested in a plethora of ways across the globe, I think, increasingly, and especially in the West. This is how it's manifesting itself here. And I think that pretty much anything that's got the big banks on side is not likely to be a winning formula quite at the moment.
I hear you. I don't know if you saw, but Peggy Noonan, who used to be Ronald Reagan's speechwriter, wrote an article that I think exactly captures this point, and it's called The Protected versus the Unprotected.
She's a brilliant writer.
And she's a brilliant writer. And what she says in 700 words is that the protected, those of us who are in the banking system, in the political world, we have built an economy and a body politic that protects us from the adverse consequences. But the unprotected are feeling all this pain. And this is the source. It's to your point. But what I'm interested in is, as someone who's been in politics for a long time, is how do we resolve this split between the protected and the unprotected? How do we address the debt problem that bears down and causes so much pain? What's your vision for how, not just for Britain necessarily, but in this modern industrialized world we're in, how do we reconcile these competing interests?
Because I think we need to move back to a much more meritocratic view of society and not protect those who have the vested interests. I'm a diehard capitalist, but I despise the crony capitalism that says you can get just as big a banking bonus if you're losing people's money than if you're making money. And I think we've got a big problem because we're obsessed with economic growth and not wealth creation. And our wealth creation comes from our innovation and our political systems and values that value individualism and creativity. Those are the things that we have to foster. And I think that what we have with the crony capitalist, if you like, or the vested interest, call it what you like, is that in order to protect those who have already done well, we are threatening the potential of those who have yet to do well and could do well on whose efforts the rest of us will ultimately depend. And getting further and further away of that from a really meritocratic model is very, very dangerous in Western society. And I think there is a huge political market for those who can actually vocalize that in a way that the voters can understand.
And I guess that lets me come to a kind of final thought on this, which is the faith and confidence in the financial system is undermined by all these things. Can it be restored? How can we restore that faith and confidence? I mean, can this happen incrementally through policy decisions? Or do we need to have almost a minor revolution where the establishment gets turfed out and new people get put in and it's a bit of a mess for a while? Do we have to go through a bit of a catastrophe to resolve this, or is there another way?
I don't think we have to go through catastrophe, but we have to recognize that the changes that we're undergoing at the moment are not a cyclical correction, but a structural correction. We have been living beyond our means for far too long. We have to wind that back in, and we have to get onto a much better equilibrium. And of course, everything in life eventually comes back to equilibrium. You can either manage it as a process, or it may become an event very unexpectedly for you. And I think that we can do that. And I think that one of the things we need to be realistic about is what intergenerational progress looks like. There's always been this argument that the American dream means that the next generation will always be better off than the previous one. I've never actually bought that, because I've always believed that the American dream was that if you worked hard and sacrificed, then your children could be better off than the previous generation. It wasn't that you can have everything that you want and that they can get better off at the same time. And I think it's this element that we now want instant gratification. We want to have everything without having to pay for it up front. And we don't want there to be any consequences of any of that. It's unrealistic. And our politicians, I'm afraid, have fed the myth. And we do need a little bit more honesty that you cannot live beyond your means for any length of time, no more as a country than you can as a family or an individual. And when we get back to some of those concepts of sound money and of honest finances, and of actually telling people that there are limits to what you can actually have, unless you work that bit extra to get them, then I think we get back into the sort of balance that we used to take for granted. My grandfather, who was a dreadful old socialist, I have to say, once said to me that the worst thing that ever happened was that you could buy things without a deposit. He said people soon won't have any idea about the value of money. And who would have thought I would have taken an economic lecture from a die-hard socialist? Well, that's how the world goes.
One thing that seems to be happening is a splitting in politics within parties, within the Republican Party, within the Tories, within Labour, as they go to the extremes. And I wonder, how does that look from the inside? What's your perception of what's driving that and how it resolves itself?
Well, I think this might be connected to this whole idea of more bespoke lives that we have. And the big political parties, the Republicans, the Democrats in the United States, the Conservatives and the Labour Party in Britain, have traditionally been very big coalitions internally. And that's enabled them to never have to deal with external coalitions. It's very different on the European continent, where you get many more fragmented parties. And if you ever read John Steinbeck's The Short Reign of Pippa IV, it gives you an idea of what that might look like if it was taken to extremes. But I think that as politics has become more commonly a single interest pursuit, then it's become more difficult to keep those big coalitions together. And I look at what's happening in the United States, and I wonder how in the ultimate consumer society, how you end up with two monolithic political movements that people have to choose from, and which have got very rigid internal mechanisms for choosing candidates. And in the United Kingdom, of course, we've just had a coalition government in the last parliament between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats. Now we've got a small majority of our own, but done with a much smaller proportion of the voters. And I wonder whether we can maintain those big internal coalitions in the future, or whether people actually have the patience to deal with it. Because I remember having a conversation with Margaret Thatcher about this and how she dealt with having such a wide spectrum of views inside her government. And she said that, but we are a broad church. And I wonder whether that broad church attitude, never mind the practicality of it, really exists so much today, or whether we have become so much obsessed with different bits of the political process that we might find that hard. I don't know. And in any case, I think voters are going to be much more picky than they were before. And you'll see the emergence of single interest parties. We've seen that in recent elections in the UK, small parties getting reasonable levels of voting support. And it may well be that we have to look at the concept of external coalitions more in the future, not because it's what we want to do or what it would be our priority to have, but it's what the voters actually may demand in a very different world where they get to choose what they want in many more spheres of life, and they may feel that they're not getting it in politics. But perish the thought that the politicians would have to do what the voters want.
Well, this raises one last question in my mind, which is politicians have had the tendency over certainly the last 100 years to dive in whenever there's an economic problem, intervene to prevent the downturn. And what you've just described, does that enhance the probability that politicians try to micromanage any downturn the economy might face, or does it increase the chance that we go back to a world where we all have to face that reality and learn how to manage it?
Well, I'm not sure it's something that politicians need to avoid completely in terms of managing a downturn, as long as they're having the counterbalancing effects on the upturn. But what politicians have tended to do in recent decades is that they prevent the pain in the downturn and they pump money into an economy, but they don't take it back out again in the upturn to get a balance over time. And so that rather than having a normal wave activity, we actually get a build-up of risk, which has to be corrected and which may well be the reason why the recessions we've had have tended to be more frequent and deeper in recent years. That may be the risk we're running for not being sufficiently robust in making corrections to our own economic cycle over time.
Well, that was fascinating, and I think it'll be very valuable for people who are trying to think about what are the consequences of a potential Brexit vote, either for or against. So thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Look, the law of unintended consequences is really big right now.
There is no world after the tomorrow where China devalues by 20%. There is no world.
I start from the presumption that the consensus is wrong.
My best advice is that you can't bring your ego into this.
The 21st century is going to be the century of China, whether we like it or not.
80% of all the crowdfunding platforms in the world are funded by hedge funds because that produces a return.